Let me tell you a story from yesterday morning, and it's a crazy story. You're not going to believe this, but I went to the grocery store. Now, stay with me here. I went to the grocery store, and over there, I went to shelves that had been stocked by people I hadn't seen. I pulled off produce that had been grown by farmers I've never met, probably in countries that I've never been to before, and I took them to an automatic checkout machine. This is not a person scanning stuff. It's an automatic checkout machine. You do it all yourself, and then I paid with an app. It's a banking app that I've never been into a physical location to set up. I just set it up all online. I've never talked to a physical human being out actually in the world or even over the phone. It's just all there on my phone. I scanned it. I didn't talk to a single person on my way there, not a single person on my way back. I came home, I closed the door, I put the stuff down, and I had this really dark feeling that something has gone kind of horribly wrong here. And it might be because I'm reading Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom right alongside you, and we are finishing out this book today. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. Thank you. If you have followed through this entire series, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure to do this. It is really, really exciting to be here at the finish line. If you've made it all the way through this book, reading as well, I mean, congratulations. This is a huge feat. I mean, this book is not an easy one to read, as you will well know if you've made it this far. And we are finishing this book today, chapter 12, An Ecological Society. And that's pretty cool. And if you saw my last video, you know that I've split these last two chapters into two separate videos because there's just so much material here. And I wanted to give this one the space to really kind of sit and reflect with Murray Bookchin's vision for an ecological society. What does that actually look like? So that's what we're going to go through today. Now, if you are already a subscriber on Patreon, thank you so much. Your support really means the world. It is so awesome to have people there who have been supporting us since the beginning as well in some cases. It's just awesome. Now, if you're not already a subscriber, do check out that Patreon feed. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. All the main feed stuff where we go through these incredible leftist books is up there for free. You can also get the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series. You can also get some videos I and my sister do about cool leftist movies. We're in our era right now of Latin American leftist films, so you can go check that out. It's just really, really cool. So please check that out if you get a chance. Don't forget to like, subscribe, tell your friends, all that good stuff, and let's get into this chapter now. Now, this is the chapter where throughout this book, Murray Bookchin, who has been giving us a story of the world that is broken by hierarchy, he kind of sums up that story and then gives us a vision for what an ecological society could actually look like. And I am going to break this chapter into three separate segments. The first one is what was lost. What is it that Bookchin is actually describing? What society breakdown is he actually talking about here? The second part is going to be talking about the three pillars. Now, this doesn't come up in chapter 12, but it's come up through the entire book. And I think that it's important to go through those three pillars one by one just to make sure we know where we are when Bookchin starts to talk about an ecological society. So that's Usufruct, it's Complementarity, or the equality of unequals, which is what Bookchin calls it in this work. And then, of course, the irreducible minimum. So we'll go through those three pillars when we get to that section. And then finally, we will talk about Utopia, the search for Utopia, because he describes a few movements in this last chapter. We'll just reference them, and then we'll get to Bookchin's own idea about Utopia. And that's going to be really cool because Bookchin is one of these thinkers that does not shy away from the word utopia. A lot of people do. Bookchin actually goes out and embraces it. And so let's talk about that on his own terms. So let us start then with what was lost. In this chapter, and throughout this book, Murray Bookchin presents us with a story of the world that has been broken by hierarchy. He says we are becoming economized. Bookchin calls this the logic of the factory. He says that the logic of the factory, which is just based, think about a factory, it's just based on production. It's just based on the most efficient way to get the product at the end. The cheapest, most efficient, most labor-light way to produce something. And Bookchin says that the logic of the factory has invaded our lives, just our everyday lives. Everything that we do is becoming economized. And that's a really, really powerful perception here, because you can feel that. I mean, if you go out in the world like I did yesterday morning when my trip to the grocery store, you feel like you're missing something in society. Like the social element of society has been cut out of it, that we are becoming increasingly more mechanized. And remember, Bookchin did not live to see this kind of hyper-digital age that we entered. Bookchin died in 2006. He did not see the rise of AI, which we're living through right now. He didn't see the sort of logical conclusion, or it's not even the logical conclusion, of the social media era. He didn't see this kind of acceleration of social media. He didn't see this level of digitization in our lives, but he already kind of reached out and recognized it. So we are becoming much more mechanical. And Bookchin uses this to put forward kind of a positive vision here, which is that society should be a process of socializing. It's kind of there in the word. But Bookchin says, listen, this process of socializing, this is what we have lost. And writing back in 1982 when this book came out, before the smartphone, right, before the internet, Bookchin reaches out and says, listen, this thing that we are missing, it's going to be missing more as we go further into this process, this kind of late stage capitalism. As we go through this process, we will lose our humanity, because humans require contact with other humans. We need to talk and discuss and interact and feel ourselves as humans through the functioning of a normal society. And you just can't do that through an app. Think about in your own life. The last time that you did what I did yesterday, you go and use an automatic checkout machine, or maybe you go and you order something on Uber Eats, or you go to Amazon to order something instead of an actual physical store. These are all things that are based on consumption as well. Let's get away from consumption and think about the last time that you went to a third space, right? You went to a club or a protest, a place of religious worship maybe. What's the last time that you commented on social media versus having an actual conversation with friends? You may come to some uncomfortable conclusions if you let yourself think about that. Our interactions with the rest of humanity, they're getting kind of smaller. They're getting more electronic. And that is a problem. I'm talking a lot about the modern currents of digitization, but of course Bookchin is seeing this as a trend since the Neolithic period, right? This is a long, long trend for Murray Bookchin, and he starts talking about something that we'll talk much more about when we get into David Graeber's book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, which is on the reading list. I think it's coming up in September. Double check those dates, but I'm pretty sure. And he talks about the gift economy. So way back then, we had what's referred to by most anthropologists as a gift economy. The way that looks is, as opposed to a barter system where I say, I have this milk and I want those eggs, why don't we exchange? That's how most people think these kind of Neolithic societies traded goods. That didn't really happen unless they were two societies that didn't really know each other, that couldn't speak the same language or something. Then that's where you see barter start to come around. But barter in sort of early traditional communities doesn't really exist that much. What you normally see is a gift economy. And what that looks like is, okay, if I need eggs, I might go tell my partner, my sibling, to go to your wife, who will then tell you, just kind of intimate, oh, I think they might need some eggs. Maybe you should drop off these extra eggs. And then I get those eggs, I have what I need. And the next time I have extra milk, I might bring you some milk because I know that you need that milk. And I just kind of, it's a way of settling transactions without ever approaching anything that looks like a market. So it definitely does not look like a barter system. And it definitely does not look like the modern day digitized marketplace that we have with Amazon.com and I don't know, high frequency derivatives trading, whatever it is. It's a very, very far cry from that. And Bookchin says that the gift economy existed back then and then started to be undermined by the idea of contract. Right now, modern day, we take contracts to be kind of the most basic element of our society. They are promises to do certain things, to pay certain things, to act in certain ways. They kind of all in exchange for other things underpin the way we live, our entire existence in our society. And Bookchin says this idea of contract is what killed off that early gift economy, because all of a sudden, everything is kind of set in stone, and you start to have to expect something from another person based on this very hardline contract that you have hammered out. And we will get further into this idea actually in our next book, which is Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, which is a fantastic book. And we'll get further into this idea of sort of the contract, especially when it comes to sort of early serfdom and the ways that the lords had to really hammer out these minute details in these early contracts because workers would just obey the absolute letter of the law of these contracts. Anyway, it is really, really interesting. Bookchin does not get into any of this, but he does say that the contract undermined the gift economy. And this was sort of the first step to us kind of losing a little bit of our socialized society. And this is a very anarchist spirit, by the way. This is actually a fundamental tenet of anarchism, in fact, because mostly this is the argument, the baseline assumption for a lot of anarchist thought. People don't need to be coerced into doing things cooperatively. That is to say, you don't need to force somebody to cooperate. Mostly people tend to just cooperate with others because we are fundamentally cooperative beings. That things like greed and hatred and warlike spirit and stuff are things that are often socialized into us by the society that we live in because we need to scrape and scramble to get ahead and to survive. And if we didn't have that need, then maybe we would just go back to the way we used to operate, just as human beings in a group, in a very small group, just cooperate for our mutual survival. That's kind of one of the baseline assumptions of anarchist theory. David Graeber, in fact, this is the second time his name has come up, has this example of the bus, right? When you are waiting for a bus, do you sort of fight your way to the front of the line and elbow people in the face to get on and get the best seat on the bus? Or do you just kind of calmly wait your turn and get on when you get on? Probably the second one. But there's no police around to enforce that behavior. There is really not really any consequences to fighting your way onto the bus. You're not being coerced by anybody. The only consequences are social consequences. And maybe not even social consequences, but sort of internalized consequences. We just sort of feel like that's not really the right way, that we should be kind of chill about getting on the bus. And that's the way we normally operate. You don't actually need to be forced or coerced into good behavior. And this is the view of society that Bookchin is kind of settling around. And he says, listen, if we want to get back to this idea, it's not a return to early society, these organic societies that he's talking about. It is, in fact, a process of what he calls re-socialization and bringing the humanity back into society. And of course, to do that, we recenter the natural world. This is a very ecological way of looking at the rehumanization of society. It's a difficult thing to do, but we will get to this idea when we start constructing our utopia. Before we get to utopia, let's talk about the three pillars. The important thing about Bookchin's three pillars is that all three of these are key to his ecological society, and all of them have existed in previous organic societies. Now, we do have to adapt these pillars to the realities of our modern situation, but these are foundational ideas in Bookchin's concept of post-scarcity anarchism. Now let's go through them. And we'll start with Usufruct. Now, Usufruct is the idea that whoever needs something uses it. We've gone through this before in the reading series. It's a pretty simple idea, right? It's just as simple as that. And this may seem pretty basic, but there are a couple of reasons why this idea is so powerful. The first is that it's a complete rejection of ownership. So whereas certain forms of Marxist thought call for workers owning the means of production, this kind of cuts through that. But this also works from the distribution side, which is a little bit of a specific difference here from general sort of Marxian thinking. So there's that common Marxist saying, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. This doesn't require that kind of needs-based calculation. You distribute things not based on sort of the work that you've put in, which is an idea that pops up in a few versions of anarchism. This is just, listen, if something is needed by somebody, if somebody needs a tool in that moment, then they use it. They just go and they take it and they use it and then they pass it along to the next person who needs it. Usufruct is a very, very powerful idea because it kind of cuts through all the nonsense of sort of having a centralized bureaucracy that would distribute goods based on needs, or having to work into a system to get something out of it. You just have general, roughly common ownership, but a specific type of common ownership that is not exactly common, but is, if you need this thing, you can use this thing. For the moment you own it, and then that ownership disappears. This is, at its core, an idea that is based in fluidity and mutual aid. So it's constant, it's ever shifting, it requires you to anticipate the needs of others and to communicate. And Bookchin really believes in this as a concept. So that's Usufruct. Let's go next to Complementarity, or what Bookchin calls it in this book, which is the equality of unequal. Complementarity goes beyond our sort of modern conception of tolerance and pluralism. It goes sort of beyond our modern notions of what we might call diversity. This is Bookchin's way of bridging the gap between society now, which is extremely individualized, and a form of society that is completely homogenized, right? He's not interested in people all being the same. He's actually very interested in difference, but difference to a point, because you cannot be hyper individualistic. You still have to be a member of a community, but it has to be complementary, right? You have to take advantage of the differences in individuals and understand that they can work together as a societal unit. And that's pretty great, because for a society to work, we don't have to be equal or homogenous. In fact, it's in many ways better if there's a degree of individuality and difference. Some people will do things better than other people, and then those others will be able to do other things better. People suit different things. They express themselves differently. They work on things in different ways, and that is incredibly valuable. Let's take this a step further, because some people will hold radically different views. Some people will live radically different lives. They'll be radically different in terms of lifestyle choices, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of potential religious views, whatever. The key is that all of these differences make human society incredibly beautiful and interesting and valuable and worth living in. And so this idea of complementarity is somewhere between homogenous groups that work just perfectly well in a society, we don't want to be bees, and somewhere between hyper-individualism, which is kind of what we're living with right now. You have to kind of bridge the gap between those two. Finally, let's talk about the irreducible minimum. Probably my favorite of the three pillars, if I'm going to be honest, just because it's such an obvious idea. And I think the way that Bookchin puts it in this book is just pitch perfect. So let's talk about the irreducible minimum. It's an annoying phrase because it's irreducible minimum. It's a lot of syllables, but it's a powerful idea. And we've talked about it before as well in this channel, but it's worth kind of summing up really quickly. This is the idea that simply by virtue of being human, you are due certain things. And that can be things like shelter, food, water, healthcare, participation in human society. You are just do these things because you are human. Not because you've done anything for them. You don't need to contribute. You don't get these things because you are a member of a particular society, or because you have worked on stuff for that society, or because you pay taxes. Definitely not because you pay taxes. You just do these things because you are human. And I probably don't have to tell you what a transformative idea this is. Think about the way that we treat unhoused people around most of the developed world, right? We have this idea that's instilled in us from a very early age that you get out as much as you put in to the system. If you work hard, you'll get rewarded. And if you aren't getting rewarded, if you are not living a good life, it's because you haven't worked hard enough. Now, that is ridiculous for many, many reasons. But in this society that Bookchin is trying to build, in this kind of ecological society based on the irreducible minimum, even if you did nothing, if you contributed nothing, you were just kind of lazing around every day and you weren't contributing in any meaningful sense to that society, guess what? You still get a hot meal every day. That's just part of treating humans with a modicum, just a baseline idea of human dignity. That's just, you are do that because you exist. And that's kind of a society that I would like to live in. But those are the three pillars, right? And they are really, really important to understand as we go into the next section, as Bookchin starts to build out his utopia. So again, that is Usufruct, the idea that you own something when you need to use it, and then you pass it along to the next person. You have Complementarity, which is the equality of unequals. Everybody doesn't need to be the same. Everybody can be wildly different, but they need to all work together as part of a cohesive whole. That's Complementarity. And then you have the Irreducible minimum, which is you are due certain things based on the fact that you are human. That's it. So let's move away from the three pillars and let's go to the search for utopia. The thing about Bookchin's chapter 12, especially as we come to this idea of utopia, is that it's either fabulous or frustrating depending on how you look at it, because there is this bit towards the end of this chapter where Bookchin goes, yeah, I'd love to imagine a utopia with you, but I will leave that in your hands. So that's basically what he says. He's going to give us the rough outlines for how this could work, but he will leave it to the discourse. And you understand why. I mean, this is a pretty high-level academic work. It's very philosophical. It's very broad strokes at certain points. So it makes sense to leave this to the discourse, but it feels very unsatisfying, or potentially it can feel very unsatisfying. Either way, let's talk about the broad strokes that Bookchin leaves us with. Bookchin uses this chapter to go through a few utopian movements to build to his conclusion. He talks about the sexual liberation of the Marquis de Sade, for example. He talks about Charles Fourier and the sort of wild utopian visions, his wild utopian socialism that Fourier is interested in. He talks about the cooperative utopia of Robert Owen, which comes much later. These are all really fascinating movements, and each of these thinkers does deserve to be looked at in much more detail. Bookchin himself kind of does like a high-level sketch of a lot of these ideas, but Bookchin kind of uses this as a backdrop to build to his utopian vision. Because again, Bookchin is not interested in shying away from this word utopia, and a lot of these thinkers leaned into this word utopia. So the utopia that Bookchin wants to build is bigger, it's broader, and it's based on the idea of re-empowerment. That's what he calls it. And it's the idea that humanity needs to re-enter natural evolution. Remember here that Bookchin thinks that humanity is essentially an attempt by nature to gain consciousness. It's something like nature gaining a consciousness, and we are part of this natural evolution, and human civilization is just one part of the process of natural evolution. But we've come so far away from nature, and so far away, in fact, from our own humanity, that we have to go back and now recenter the natural world in human civilization. And to get there, Bookchin sets out his ideas of libertarian municipalism, which is not something that he uses in the original version of this book. This comes around in the 1991 introduction, if you've got this copy of the book, but also a multitude of later works by Bookchin, which you can look at and kind of read. But for all intents and purposes, we'll call this libertarian municipalism because that's what it becomes. So it is direct democracy and confederation. So each municipality governs its own affairs, making decisions through direct democracy, and then when we get decisions that affect multiple municipalities, we come to a confederation. A council is formed to deal with those issues, and each municipality sends a representative who is recallable and completely accountable to that municipality, and they go and vote on that thing. That's the vision that Bookchin is building for libertarian municipalism. We will talk about how this works in practice next week when we look at things like the Occupy Wall Street, we look at things like Rojava. These are really interesting sort of modern applications of the way that this works, but this is the rough outline that Bookchin is sketching here. By the time we get to the end of the Ecology of Freedom, it's a little half informed. I'm gonna be very honest here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull from some later Bookchin works because he really goes on to write much, much more about this idea and expands it much more. So there's a book, for example, called Remaking Society. It's very short. It's very good. If you are interested in this idea, I highly recommend that you go read it. It's actually quite a bit more readable than the Ecology of Freedom, but I'm pulling a little bit on this Remaking Society book just to get to this idea of, or a little more developed, a little more nuanced idea of what this could look like. So, for example, he talks about the city. Early cities, Bookchin says, were not supposed to be this giant sprawling belt of development. And he refers to Aristotle, for example. Aristotle talked about how cities should never be so big that you couldn't hear a cry for help from the city walls. That's kind of the maximum limit for what a city should be. And Bookchin has this idea, I've got a quote from him here, that frames this idea of a municipality. He says, the city, as a humanly scaled, self-governing municipality, freely and confederally associated with other humanly scaled, self-governing municipalities, is dissolving into huge urban belts. The citizen, as an active formulator of policies, is being reduced to a passive taxpayer, the mere recipient of public services provided by bureaucratic agencies. Politics is being degraded into statecraft, an art practiced by cynical, professional manipulators of power. He goes on later in this book to talk about something very important. He says, this approach presupposes that we are talking about a movement, not isolated instances where people in a single community assume control of their municipality and restructure it on the basis of neighborhood assemblies. It presupposes that a movement will exist that alters one community after another and establishes a system of confederal relationships between municipalities, one that will form a regional power in its own right. So all of this happens in a broader context of movement, which is difficult. And he's very forthright about this. But it's not impossible, and it has been done before. There is an idea that Bookchin will go on to develop in more detail, which is this idea of decentralization. So this idea of decentralization is linked to the use of sort of smaller scale technologies, just like he talks about in the Ecology of Freedom. These are technologies, or more accurately, techniques, we've talked about this before, that are embedded in the needs of the community and are in harmony with the natural world. So this only happens as you begin to decentralize power out of these hyper-concentrated bits and into municipalities, local communities that are ecologically connected. Bookchin also talks about the need for culture here. He wants to explain a little bit about what the culture of this kind of utopia could look like. He says that we need a culture that rids our psyches of hierarchy. This is something that we're born into, and so to rid ourselves of this way of thinking, we need to be born in a culture that is liberatory and kind of revolutionary. And if you hear echoes in here of Frantz Fanon, who wrote in The Wretched of the Earth about fostering a revolutionary culture in post-independence Algeria, yeah, there's a reason for that. It's a tough thing to do, to build culture, but it is something that you sort of need to do if you want to foster this kind of sentiment that can provide the bedrock for the society that is going to come and do these utopian things that you want to do. And through all of this, Bookchin calls on us to build peopled institutions, which are in harmony with nature. Peopled institutions refers to this idea that we talked about right at the beginning, that society is about social interaction, and the institutions that run through the ecological utopia that he's trying to build, they're based on people, and they are full of people. And your interactions are going to make this thing work. And then when it comes to the harmony and balance of nature, this is the marriage of first nature and second nature. He's talked about this before. These two things need to come into harmony. We need to re-enter our natural evolution as humanity. And of course, these are, at their core, institutions that feature those three pillars: Usufruct, Complementarity, and the Irreducible minimum. They have to, otherwise none of this is going to work. And that is where Bookchin leaves us at the end of the Ecology of Freedom, having developed a theory of social ecology that is at an elemental level revolutionary. If you ask me, I think it is actually a good thing that Bookchin doesn't try to pull like a John Locke and try to write a constitution for a society that will exist based on his perfect notions of how this will work. I think it's actually more helpful that Bookchin leaves that task in our hands. He's kind of leaving us with a powerful new tool to go and reshape the world. And that's very, very significant. Of course, that's what a lot of people tried to do after this book was published and other works by Bookchin. This was a profoundly influential thing, a really profound and powerful tool that he left people. And so a bunch of people did try to go out and build societies based on this thing. And that is what we are going to talk about next week when we get into some of the movements that tried to build utopian societies based on the work of Murray Bookchin. And so you will see ideas reflected in things like eco-villages. We'll talk about an example from Barcelona. You'll see a couple of these ideas in Occupy Wall Street, and there is sort of one major departure that we'll talk about when we get to Occupy that makes it a little bit different from Bookchin's ideas, and potentially one of the reasons that it wasn't terribly effective in the first things that it set out to do, even though Occupy Wall Street was a profoundly influential movement. And then we'll also talk about Rojava. Now, Rojava is probably the most significant of these. It is, of course, the autonomous Kurdish region in northern Syria, and it is really, really worthy of discussion, even though it is an incredibly complicated thing to get into. So we will get into that next week, and we'll talk a lot about that effort next time. If you've made it through this book, congratulations. I mean, this is an important one, and I think the things that you've read in here, even though I have been the first to disagree with a bunch of stuff that is in here, I think you will find yourself thinking about these ideas even more as you go along. Now, if you are a member on the Patreon channel, you will get the sort of general summary of this book and then kind of key takeaways. I always do sort of a wrap-up video for these series, and if you're a member, you can go and watch those. So we'll talk about sort of what you need to know from Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom. You can find that on the channel. And yes, until then, that'll be up in 2 weeks. So until then, thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, all that good stuff. Let me know what you think, as always, and I will see you next time. Thank you.